This episode was brought to you in part by Garden in Minutes. The Garden in Minutes garden grids are exactly what you need to irrigate your raised beds during the summer. To get 7% off of these grids or to check out their rectangular metal raised beds, go to journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use my promo code Jill. As a podcast listener, you get 7% off of your order. journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes. You're walking your garden on a beautiful June day and you notice that something is not quite right. Maybe you notice large holes in your leaves, or maybe small holes, tiny holes. Maybe entire leaves are missing altogether, or the leaves just don't look right. Maybe they look puckered a bit. We talked in last week's episode about how as organic gardeners, we don't want to, when we start seeing evidence of a pest, start blindly applying insecticides. Number one, even if we're applying organic controls, many still aren't safe across the board for beneficial insects. And number two, not all organic insecticides work for all pests. It really does boil down to then identifying the culprit. That makes the biggest difference and should be step number one when we start seeing issues with our plants. Today, I'm going to teach you how to channel your inner Sherlock Holmes or Nancy Drew, if you're of my generation, and identify the culprit, or at least get close enough to know what might be causing the problem so that you know what to do. In this episode, we're going to be talking about 10 problems that you might see as you go out in your garden. Like everything else, this is not exhaustive, but I'm hoping that these are going to be pretty common issues that will apply a lot of the times when you're just not sure what to do when you see problems. And then at the end, I'll give you some quick tips that I think will also help you when it comes to identifying the problem and trying to figure out what you're dealing with. Problem number one is that you see an insect, but you don't see damage. This is an issue that I see a lot of beginners talking to me about because they are hyper-focused about problematic pests in their garden. So if they see any kind of bug, they panic like, oh no, what do I need to do? This is a completely normal reaction, but I just want to encourage you to step back just a moment and remember, or if this is new to you, understand that not all bugs that you see in your garden are actually harmful. In fact, most of them, the overwhelming majority, are either good bugs or they are benign. They're just doing their thing. They really don't bother you one way or the other. They're not super beneficial either, but they're part of the ecosystem. So we don't want to get rid of all the bugs in our garden. We kind of talked about that a little bit last year. So what I would recommend to you, because sometimes we do see bugs on our plants before we see damage. So what we want to do is we want to try to identify the bug if we can, even if we don't see damage. There are lots of ways that you can do this, and this will apply for really everything we're talking about. But one of my favorite tools is an app called Picture Insect. Now, this is an app that I've been using for the past several years. It's not free. I think it's $20 a year maybe, but for me, it's been worth it. You can get a monthly plan too. And so if you have a short growing season, you might want to do the monthly plan and just do it for the garden season. All that to say, I have found that it's the most accurate and reliable app that I've found. Now, if you have other apps that have come on the market, I have tried a couple of other ones that I have not found to be as accurate as Picture Insect, but I'm sure there are some out there. And you could also use Google. One thing that you can do is you can just describe the insect into Google or your favorite search engine. And these days with AI, I'm sure that's getting better and better. And you might actually just be able to get on the right track to figure out what it is. So there are lots of ways that you can do this. You could also have books handy. You can look at pictures. You can, sometimes I'll just describe it in Google Images and see what comes up. So you can just do kind of your own research there. But the key is you want to try to identify what the bug is so that you can get an idea of whether it's friend or foe or neither one. But if you still can't figure out what the bug is that you're seeing, my suggestion is just to watch the plant and see if any damage occurs in the next few days, the next few weeks. Because if it's a problem, then you're going to start seeing evidence of the issue on your plant. But I would definitely not just blindly add something just in case it's a bad bug. That is something that gardeners did for a long time, and I'm so glad that the tide is turning. But if you're a new gardener, resist the urge to what I call panic spray. If you don't know for sure that it's causing a problem, wait and see. And then most of the time, it's probably not going to be an issue, but definitely keep an eye on it. Problem number 2 is if you walk out, and I did this last week, you see the entire top portion of the plant cut, like someone just took a weed eater to the plant. And there's a stub. In my case, it was sunflowers, and they were pretty mature sunflowers. The ones that hadn't been affected were probably 3 or 4 feet, and the ones that were affected were probably 8 inches tall. And I was like, what in the world could that be? It left a stub. Now, my 2 possibilities, just because these are the 2 things that I've seen in my garden area, would be deer and rabbits. And I really didn't think it was deer because we have a fence and I've never seen the deer hop the fence before in my 10 years of having this garden. But the amount of a stub on that sunflower that was left made me wonder if a rabbit was tall enough to do that, because it was kind of tall. But then I went out in my garden one day and I saw the most mature large rabbit I have probably ever seen. I'm like, yeah, I think the rabbit did that. So I was able to identify most likely what had happened there. But again, even in the issues of critters is kind of the blanket term I'm going to call them, we want to know exactly what we're dealing with. A short-term solution for both deer and rabbits would be some kind of a repellent. I have found the Zone Protect's Oh Deer product to be really, really good, because right now I've got so many breaches in my fence in my garden because my large garden I'm not really focusing too much on, but I do have some crops. And when I notice that I've had some kind of damage, I've gone out there and I've sprayed that Oh Deer. And like I said, it's rabbits. I don't think the deer are getting in my garden. And if I do that, and I've even done it every week or 2 or after a rain, I've not had any additional damage. That's the only repellent I've ever been able to use that I actually have seen progress with. But you can do something like that short term. Long term, you definitely want to have some kind of fence just to make sure. Deer would need a taller fence. Rabbits need, it's hard with rabbits, honestly, because rabbits keep figuring out a way to get under and over my fences, but some kind of barrier. Another short-term solution, I've done this before, is some kind of a short-term chicken wire or cage or something, at least until the crops get taller, especially if you're dealing with rabbits, because usually once the crops get mature, the rabbits aren't going to mess with them. It's usually the smaller ones. So if you can have some kind of a temporary barrier, then that would be something that you could do with rabbits, which I've done before. But deer and rabbits are not the only issues. Critters can cause all sorts of issues in the garden. I'm actually not going to go into all of those, but if you're interested, Susan Mulvihill's book, if you're on YouTube, you're seeing this, called The Vegetable Garden Problem Solver Handbook. She has a whole section on different critters. So this is a really good resource for you if you're interested, or if you're trying to figure out that you're dealing with all sorts of critters like squirrels and gophers and groundhogs, and I think that's one of them. Anyway, there's a whole section. You might be interested in this. But we're going to be talking more about pests and bugs today. And so that's why I wanted to point you to that resource if you're dealing with an animal. As we move on to these 8 other problems, what I'm going to talk to you about is the symptom you're going to see perhaps in your plant, and then what the culprit might be. And we're actually going to be going a lot deeper into all of this in my pest control workshop, which is happening tomorrow. If you're listening to this or watching this live on Tuesday, it's going to be on June 12th, Wednesday, June 12th at 7 p.m. Central. If you are listening to this podcast after we've done the workshop, we'll have a link for you to get the replay. But these last 8 problems I'm going to talk to you about today, it's taken directly from that workshop. We're just going to go more in depth in each one. My goal for you today on the podcast, though, is to give you a starting point on trying to figure out if you see these symptoms, then this is possibly what could be the problem. And then you can start researching what to do about it. And if you're interested in the pest control workshop, the link is going to be in the show notes, or you can go to journeywithjill.net/pest workshop. Okay, so problem number 3 is large holes chewed in the leaves, and you don't see any excrement. And excrement would be basically what some of the insects will leave behind. But in this case, you don't see any excrement visible. The problem here could be several different things. It could be any kind of beetle or earwigs, slugs, snails, grasshoppers. Many times these insects, these pests are visible in the daytime. All you have to do is just look a little bit or look underneath the leaves, but sometimes they're not visible during the day. Sometimes these pests are going to be more visible at night. So in order to properly identify these, you're probably going to have to go outside with a flashlight at night when they're most likely to be feeding. Problem number 4 is similar, but there's one slight difference. You see large holes chewed in the leaves, but you see excrement visible. Now, if you see excrement, a lot of times it's black, it's small, and a lot of times it's just sitting there on the leaves. Most often, this is going to be caused by some kind of worm. And again, with worms, most likely they are going to be visible to you in the daytime. Now, in the case of tomato hornworms, they are technically right in front of your face, but sometimes it's hard to see them because they blend in so well with the foliage. We're going to talk about one thing you can do to identify that a little bit later. But worms are typically pretty visible. So if you see holes and then you see excrement, you probably will see a worm somewhere in the vicinity. But here's the thing, you've got, in problems number 3 and number 4, you've got large holes chewed in the leaves, but depending on whether it's a worm or something else, that's going to definitely change how you might deal with it, because what organic control will work for worms is not going to work for beetles. So that's why it's really important to understand exactly what you're dealing with. Problem number 5 is very common, especially in the early spring. Small plants you'll find are cut off at the soil line. You go out into your garden, you have these small seedlings, you're so excited, but then they're just gone or they're tipped over. Most of the time, this is caused by cutworms. What cutworms will do is they will come and they will chew right at the soil line. For many years, I wouldn't even plant a transplant of a tomato or corn without having some kind of barrier. In my early years, I would cut little 1-inch sections of toilet paper roll and I would put on every single tomato transplant. And then I just noticed after time, I really didn't have any problems with cutworms, which we talked about last episode. Sometimes you'll have issues, sometimes you won't. With corn, I would put toothpicks on every corn sprout just because I did have problems with cutworms with corn. So all that to say, that's definitely something that you want to protect against if you know that it's cutworms. And honestly, I don't know that I saw that many cutworms, so I just saw the damage. But to prevent that, those are some things that you can do. Also, earwigs, mole crickets can do this, and pill bugs can do this. This is something that I've actually had more issues with in the last few years. Pill bugs, also known as roly-polies. Typically, you see them in compost or leaf litter. I feel like when I started using leaves as mulch, they were more numerous in my garden. I guess everything kind of has a catch-22, right? But what you'll notice with the pill bugs is they're pretty obvious. You'll be able to see them around your plant. But sometimes, like I said, with cutworms, they might not be. But still, the key is the same. You want to try to figure out what the problem is so that you know what to do about it. If, like me, you just see plants completely on their side and you don't see any other issues, then I would usually assume cutworms. And then I would do what I could to protect the plants. If it's a very small plant, it's probably not going to come back. If it's a larger plant, cutworms are probably not going to cause a problem anyway. Again, this is going to be an issue more for small plants. Same thing with pill bugs. If I can get the plant to a certain maturity, they're not going to bother it. So this is really more of a problem with really young plants. Often then it's a matter of protecting the young seedlings until they can outgrow the issue. Problem number 6 is small round holes in the leaves. This is very common in the early spring, and often this is due to flea beetles. We talked about this a little bit in last week's episode, but in the case of flea beetles, most of the time you can either see the flea beetles, and they're called flea beetles because they're very small, but they're still visible. Most of the time they're black, but they could also be iridescent green, brown. They can be different colors, but they're just really, really small. For me, the presence of flea beetles is more indicated by the damage to the plant because the damage is a distinct shotgun type holes in the leaves. That's what it looks like. And almost always I can find presence of flea beetles at some point. And as we talked about last week, a lot of times the plants will outgrow the damage to flea beetles, but If you know that in your area you have a bigger problem with it, covering ahead of time with insect netting is a really good idea. As I'll talk about more in the pest control workshop, dealing with beetles is probably the hardest thing to deal with. There's very little organic control that is very effective. So a lot of times we have to learn some other alternative ways to deal with things besides just spraying, and I'll talk about all of that in the pest control workshop as well. But in the case of flea beetles, hopefully, if we plant it at the right time, our crops will be able to outgrow the issue. Problem number 7 is puckered, twisted leaves. Now, when I say twisted, you definitely need to look for the presence of an insect, because I have to say, this is kind of off the subject, but I have seen so many examples of herbicide damage this year that it's just heartbreaking, because I've had that happen. So if you don't see any kind of insects like we're going to talk about, and you see, especially on your tomato plants, you see twisted leaves that just really weird looking, Google what it looks like for herbicide damage on tomatoes and see if that could be the issue. But sometimes aphids and mites can cause this puckered look to leaves, especially on tomatoes, but also other crops as well. And sometimes that puckering, if it's really damaged, it can start to twist those leaves. But still, having experienced both herbicide damage and the puckering that's caused by aphids, the difference is still distinct. But if you're a new gardener, you may not be able to tell the difference. So if you see the puckered leaves, even if they start to twist, take a look and see if you can identify aphids or mites. A lot of times they're going to congregate on the underside of the leaf. And in the case of peppers or tomatoes, if your plants are starting to flower, or even right before they flower, they love getting on those new flowers. I'm guessing because they're quite sweet. But you can see the presence of those on those flowers. Now, with aphids, for sure, I've talked about this ad nauseum, I think. I leave them because, especially if they're out in the garden, they are food for beneficial insects. So I'm like, okay, here, ladybug, my garden right here, right? So I'm not going to do anything for aphids. In the greenhouse, it's a little bit different. I will do some other things like spray a blast of water to get the aphids off. I also sometimes will add worm castings to the soil, which can cause a systemic reaction for the aphid itself. But typically in the garden, aphids are not a huge problem. But if they are, you can look up some other things to do. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the pest control workshop as well. But if you start noticing these puckered, twisted leaves, most likely it's going to be aphids or some kind of a mite. Now, mites are a little bit more difficult to deal with. They're kind of new to me. So I'm still honestly I've got on my radar trying to figure out what to do with those. But typically they're not as big of a problem outside as they are in the greenhouse. So that's definitely something to look at if you don't see aphids. Problem number 8 is skeletonized leaves. And this is just where the leaves are getting eaten, but not completely, so that they just look like a skeleton. There's lots of large holes, and most likely this is caused by some kind of beetle. Typically they're the larger beetles because they're eating larger holes. At least that's been my experience. And most of the time you can see the beetles, especially in a really bad infestation. You can see the presence. Again, look on the underside. Again, if you have to, you might need to go outside at night. But typically beetles can be the problem with the significant skeletonized leaves. Also, I've noticed that grasshoppers can do this as well, especially later in the season. But again, these are larger insects, so you should be able to identify them in your garden and see what you're dealing with. Problem number 9 is partially or fully defoliated plants. This is when most of the leaves are gone, maybe just the stems remain. This can be the case. This can be caused by worms, grasshoppers, and sometimes even beetles can do this, especially if there's a big infestation. But most of the time when that's happened to my crops, it's worms of some sort and grasshoppers. Most of us have seen, or if we haven't experienced it before, we've seen online how tomato hornworms do this. They are notorious for you go outside and your tomato plants, all you see is stems. Most likely there is a tomato hornworm in the vicinity. But also other worms can do this. Army worms are bad at this. And then grasshoppers can also be like that for sure. Although grasshoppers, in my experience, has been more of the skeletonized, but they can also, in a bad infestation, they can also defoliate a plant. Number 10 is when you see bleached out portions of the leaves. Now, I'm not talking about just where your leaves look like green. I'm more talking about where you can see a clear difference between the healthy tissue of the leaf and something that's just not right. It's more of a white tissue. If you see lines, like clear lines, this is going to be caused by a leaf miner. I have to be honest with you, I've never treated for a leaf miner ever. Usually the damage is cosmetic. It's not really an issue. But if it's more of a mosaic pattern where you can just see a splotch of bleached out leaf here, a splotch of bleached out leaf there, this might be caused by some kind of a smaller beetle. The one time I saw this as a bigger issue was when I had harlequin bugs, and I think they were on my fall brassica plants. And it's really the only time that I've ever dealt with harlequin bugs, but they can be destructive. I think the reason that they haven't been an issue since then is I was very diligent with hand picking, which is something I'll talk about a lot more in the pest control workshop. How to do that safely. Last year I had an issue with a particular beetle that I am really glad I Googled whether I should hand pick those or not, because apparently it can be quite painful. So we'll talk about that in the workshop as well. Definitely make sure that you know what you're dealing with, or wear gloves if you hand pick. But kind of back to the whole, if you see a bleached out portion of your leaf and it's in a mosaic pattern, it's probably some kind of a beetle, or at least that would be the first place that I would look to see what the problem might be. Those are 10 signs I would say that are probably the most common that you might see in your garden, and just giving you some ideas of what the problem might be. Because again, identifying the problem is the first step to any type of trying to figure out what's going wrong with your plants. But I want to leave you with 4 other tips that I think will be helpful in identifying the problem. Number 1 is to consider what crop it is. Let me give you an example. One year I was looking at my potato leaves and they had kind of some puckered holes in it, but it looked a little bit different than flea beetles. I'm pretty familiar with what flea beetle damage is. It was a little bit different than that, but I wasn't able to figure out what the problem was. I wasn't able to identify. I wasn't able to see anything on the leaves. So I did a Google search on pests that can attack that plant. And you can see all sorts of lists of different pests. I would be careful doing this if you're a brand new gardener, because understand, just because a particular crop can be hammered by 20 different pests doesn't mean you're going to have all 20 of those in your garden. I know I was overwhelmed with that as a beginning gardener, like, oh my goodness, everything's out to get my crop. But that's not the case. Usually it's just a few. But having that list is very helpful, because what I was able to find out was that I had what's called, if I'm not mistaken, potato leafhopper. And it's a very small bug that is green, so it's the same color as the plant. And once I was able to identify that might be the problem, I was actually able to see it because I knew what I was looking for. What you need to know is that some insects are going to go to multiple plants, but most of them actually prefer certain plants over the other. So consider what plant you're looking at and then Google what that is and what pests can commonly attack it. And that will at least give you a direction to go to as far as trying to identify what might be the issue with that plant. Now, if you're overwhelmed with options, because like I said, you could find like 20 different pests, put in your location. This was a tip that I saw from Susan Mulvihill's book. And she talked about, describing the pest that you might see if you see it, or like what pests can attack this, and then put your location in, because sometimes pests are region specific. There are some pests that attack my garden in Arkansas that would never attack a garden, or hasn't yet anyway, in the Pacific Northwest. So putting your region can definitely help. And another reason this is helpful is because if your region has a specific pest that isn't common in all regions, it's probably not going to make all of the lists, right? Because if I don't ever deal with a particular pest, let's say pickleworm, for instance, then I'm probably not going to write about it or talk about it. I know about it because you guys tell me about it, those who are in the South. But if you live in an area where, not a lot of garden writing is happening, you may not be able to find that particular pest. So put your location, that might be able to help. Tip number 2 is to use a magnifying glass. As I mentioned with the leafhopper, some of these pests are very small. Sometimes all you're going to see is the damage with your naked eye. So being able to have a magnifying glass can help you perhaps see something that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Number 3, I mentioned going out at night. This is something that's important. If you cannot figure out what's causing the problem with your plants, you're out there during the day, you cannot see any evidence of damage. Maybe you've already Googled it, you've done everything I've told you to do. Go outside at night with a flashlight. I will warn you though, it is active in your garden at night. You have no idea. And my garden is a little bit further away from my house and there's not a whole lot of lights out there. And it's like a whole other planet. And it's a little spooky, to be quite frank with you, because that garden is alive. Not to freak you out or anything, but all that to say, going out at night, you can see all sorts of things. And most likely, if you have something that's attacking your plant that you can't see during the day, I bet you'll be able to identify it at night. And going a step further, if you know you have an issue with tomato hornworms, but for the life of you, you can't find it, or you're worried that there are more out there that you can't see, using a black light at night makes them glow. It's this iridescent neon glow. It's actually quite fascinating because, and it's not just the hornworms that'll glow. Some of the other beetles and some of the other insects will glow too. It's actually kind of interesting. It's like going to play mini golf at one of those black light places, right? We did that one time on vacation. That's kind of what it's like in your garden if you take a black light out there. It's so fun. So if you know, well, it's fun to be able to see. It's not fun to see, wow, look at all the hornworms on my tomato. But again, if you can, hornworms are easy to deal with if you can identify them. All you have to do is get over any squeamishness that you have and handpick them. And then you can get rid of them pretty easily without having to spray anything. But using that black light at night definitely helps you be able to find them. And then finally, when you're trying to identify what pest you're dealing with, consider that insects are going to go through different stages. They're going to have the egg, and then they're going to have the pupa, and I'm hoping I can get all of these terms right, but you've got the larva, and then you've got the adult, and they're all going to look very different. If you take the ladybug, for example, ladybug eggs look very similar. I've never been able to really distinguish them. I'm sure a more trained eye could, but I have never been able to distinguish them from some other beetle eggs. So if I see eggs, usually I'm not going to kill them because I don't know if they're good or bad. But then you move to the next stage and they're the little alligator. I think it's that stage. I can't remember which stage comes first, but they look like little black and orange alligator. But then there's another stage of the ladybug that they look very much like Colorado potato beetles, at least the larva of Colorado potato beetles. So that one looks very different from the adult. It looks very different from the little baby that we see, crawling around. So understand that, I mean, to me, when I realized this, I was like, man, so not only do I have to figure out what this is, I have to know what all 4 stages look like, and I'm never going to figure it out. But you don't have to figure it all out. Just understand that could be the case. You may be seeing something that's actually a certain stage of an insect, and it could be a pest insect and it could be a good insect, but just realize that you might be seeing a different stage than what you would assume an adult would look like. I for sure hope that this has been helpful for you to be able to think about how to identify any kind of damage that I hope that this has been helpful for you to try to take some steps to identify insects, problems that could be going on in your garden. This is the time of year where we really start to see this happening if we haven't already. Going through the season, though, it can be a little bit more difficult, especially as pests, at least in my area, start to ramp up. I'm definitely outgrowing some of the pests, or the plants are outgrowing some of the pests, but then as soon as you outgrow your aphids, then you eventually have Japanese beetles. So it is kind of a long game here, but identifying the problem definitely makes a big difference. And I'll be talking about solutions. So today we're talking about identification because that's the first step, but solutions is really what's going to help you to be able to maintain an organic garden that you actually can continue to harvest from. That's the goal, right? And we'll be talking about all of that in the workshop tomorrow, or if you're listening to this later, in the replay, and you can go to journeywithjill.net/pest workshop. Now, if you're brand new, you may want to download this free download that I have. It's called Good Bugs and Bad Bugs ID. It's a cheat sheet, And it gives you some pictures of some of the most common good and bad bugs so that you can identify them. And this will actually be in your workbook if you come to the workshop. But if you just want it for free, it's a standalone sheet that can help you get started with identifying. You can go to journeywithjill.net/good-and-bad-bugs. So if you're interested in that, check that out. We'll also have the link down below. Again, journeywithjill.net/good-and-bad-bugs. But I will say I do hope to see you in the workshop, because this can be one of the most frustrating things about a garden, especially you have dreamed and you have planned and you have done all of this work just to have something threatening it. It can be very frustrating, but you're not alone. We all deal with it. And hopefully with this workshop, you'll be able to have some strategies that you can take away with you, whether that's trading in your non-organic insecticide for an organic one, or whether that's trying to figure out how to invite good bugs in your garden so that they can do the patrol for you, or advanced strategies that can help you start to almost completely get rid of any kind of spray. And honestly, some of those strategies I like because they're less hands-on. They let me be a little bit lazier, but they do require a little bit of forethought. And we'll talk about that in the workshop. So I hope I can see you there, or like I said, you can catch the replay at your convenience at journeywithjill.net/pest-workshop. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you have enjoyed this episode, and I'll chat with you again on the next.